there's something I need to admit. Something I've spent far too long trying to explain away with logic. I told myself you were just another person passing through my life. Another conversation, another voice, another face that time would eventually blur into memory. That's what always happens. People arrive, they leave. And whatever they leave behind slowly fades until all that remains is a lesson. That's how I've always understood connection. Temporary, predictable, manageable. But then something happened that didn't belong to any pattern I knew. You never became a memory. You became a presence. Not the kind that asks for attention, not the kind that demands to be noticed, the kind that quietly exists beneath everything else, like gravity, invisible constant, impossible to ignore once you realize it's there. At first, I didn't recognize what was happening. I thought I was simply becoming more aware, more observant, more sensitive to small details. But awareness doesn't explain why someone begins to feel familiar before they've earned familiarity. That's what disturbed me, because familiarity usually comes with history, shared experiences, long conversations, time enough moments stacked together until trust forms naturally. We didn't have that. And yet my mind reacted as though we did. It was as if some part of me skipped every step people are supposed to take. No introductions, no slow unfolding, no careful examination, just recognition, the kind that arrives without permission, the kind that doesn't ask whether it makes sense. It simply exists. I tried to resist it, not because I feared you, because I feared certainty that arrived without evidence. I've always believed certainty should be earned, built piece by piece, verified through time. But this certainty ignored every rule I trusted. It stood there quietly, asking nothing from me while refusing to disappear. Every conversation only made it stronger. Every silence confirmed something words couldn't explain. You never tried to impress me. You never tried to become important. You never reached for closeness. And somehow, that's exactly why you became impossible to overlook. Most people chase significance. You never did. You simply carried it without announcing it, without performing it, without even realizing it. That's rare, because the loudest people often hide the emptiest intentions. But the deepest people rarely need to convince anyone of who they are. They just exist. And existence speaks louder than performance ever could. I began noticing something strange. Whenever the world became noisy, my thoughts returned to you, not because I missed you, not because I needed you, because your presence represented something my mind had been searching for long before I met you. Clarity, not comfort, truth, not reassurance. There's a difference. Comfort tells you what you want to hear. Truth quietly waits until you're ready to hear what you've been avoiding. You became that truth without trying, without speaking it directly. Just by existing exactly as you were, that's what unsettled me the most. You never changed yourself to fit my expectations. You never adjusted your thoughts so they'd be easier to understand. You remained completely yourself. And somehow, that made me stop pretending to be anyone else. I didn't decide to lower my guard. It lowered itself. Not because I trusted blindly, because pretending suddenly felt unnecessary. That had never happened before. I've spent years building distance so carefully that no one ever noticed it was there. I mastered silence. I mastered restraint. I mastered the art of revealing just enough to remain understood, but never enough to be truly known. Then you arrived, and without asking a single question, you stood in front of every wall I had built. You didn't tear them down. You didn't climb over them. You simply looked through them as though they had never existed. That's when I understood something I wasn't prepared to accept. Some people don't enter your life through the front door. They appear inside the rooms you believed no one could reach. And once that happens, nothing inside you remains arranged the way it was before. because recognition isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive with dramatic moments or impossible promises. It arrives quietly until one day you realize the person standing in front of you feels less like someone you met and more like someone you somehow forgot, and that realization changes everything. There's a difference between remembering someone and realizing they've become part of the way your mind works. I didn't notice the exact moment it happened. There wasn't a single conversation, no dramatic confession, no unforgettable event that divided my life into before and after. It happened quietly, so quietly that I almost missed it, until one day I caught myself seeing the world through a perspective that wasn't entirely my own. That's when I understood. You were no longer someone I thought about. You had become someone I thought with. That distinction changed everything. Because thinking about someone still keeps them separate from you. There's distance, choice control. You can redirect your attention. You can convince yourself it doesn't matter. You can walk away, but when someone becomes part of your thinking, there's nowhere to walk. Because they're no longer outside your mind. They've become part of its architecture. At first, I refused to believe it. I blamed coincidence, habit, the strange ways memory connects unrelated things. I searched for ordinary explanations because ordinary explanations feel safe. But the truth refused to become ordinary. Every thought I examined led back to the same realization. You weren't interrupting my mind. You were organizing it. Ideas became clearer. Questions became deeper. Silence became meaningful, not because you answered anything, but because your presence had changed the way I asked the questions. That frightened me, not because I felt dependent. I didn't. It frightened me because I had always believed my inner world belonged only to me, a place untouched by anyone else's influence, a place I protected with relentless discipline. No one entered that space. Not family, not friends, not anyone, yet somehow you never entered it. You were already there, as if my mind had been leaving a place for you long before I knew your name. How do you explain something like that? Logic doesn't. Mirror can't. Time doesn't move fast enough to create that level of familiarity. So, what remains? Recognition. The kind that exists beneath explanation, the kind that makes certainty arrive before evidence. I began noticing it in moments no one else would understand. A sentence would stop halfway because somehow I already knew how you would finish the thought. A quiet room no longer felt empty. A difficult decision suddenly seemed simpler because I instinctively knew the perspective you would bring. You never spoke. Yet somehow your understanding echoed inside my own. That isn't imagination. Imagination fades when reality interrupts. This only became stronger day after day, conversation after conversation, silence after silence, until denying it required more effort than accepting it. That's when I realized something even more unsettling. You hadn't changed who I was. You had revealed parts of me I didn't know were waiting to exist. The strange thing about real alignment is that it never feels like becoming someone else. It feels like becoming more completely yourself. That's why I stopped resisting. Not because I had answers. Because resistance no longer made sense. Some truths don't ask for permission. They simply remain waiting until you're willing to stop arguing with what you've already known all along. And maybe that's what you've been from the beginning. Not an unexpected chapter, not a beautiful accident, but the missing perspective my mind had been searching for long before either of us realized the search had already ended. There comes a moment in every rare connection when the question is no longer, what is happening? The question becomes, who am I now that it has happened? I think I've reached that moment because this stopped feeling temporary a long time ago. It stopped feeling like curiosity. It stopped feeling like coincidence. What remains now is something quieter and far more permanent. A shift, not in my emotions. In my reality, I've always believed that people leave traces behind. A conversation leaves an idea. A memory leaves a lesson. A goodbye leaves an empty space. But you didn't leave a trace. You altered the ground beneath everything else. I didn't notice it immediately. Foundations never announce when they're changing. Buildings don't shake. The sky doesn't darken. Life continues exactly as it always has. Until one day, you realize the person standing in the mirror no longer interprets the world the same way. That's just what happened to me, without asking permission, without demanding attention, without trying to become important. You changed the reference point from which I understand everything. Now every conversation carries more weight. Every silence carries more meaning. Every decision passes through a question I never used to ask. Does this feel true? Not comfortable, not convenient. True? And somehow, your presence became the standard by which I recognize the difference. That's the part I still struggle to explain, because influence usually comes from effort. Someone teaches you, challenges you, changes your mind. You did none of those things. You simply remained completely yourself. And somehow, that gave me permission to stop performing versions of myself that were never real to begin with. Do you know how rare that is? To meet someone who doesn't ask you to become more, but somehow makes you become more anyway. Not through pressure, through presence. Most people enter your life carrying expectations about who you should be, how you should speak, how much you should reveal, how quickly you should trust. You carried none. You never reached for the parts of me I kept hidden. You simply waited, not because you expected them to appear, but because you understood that truth never responds to force. It reveals itself only where it feels safe. That's when I understood something I had spent years refusing to believe. Safety isn't created by promises. It isn't created by words. It's created by presence, by someone whose existence quietly tells your nervous system. You don't have to defend yourself here. And defenses don't disappear because they're weak. They disappear because they're no longer necessary. That's what happened, not all at once, but piece by piece, wall after wall, until I looked around my own mind and realized I was standing somewhere I had never allowed another person to reach. The frightening part isn't that you know me. The frightening part is that I no longer know who I would be if I had never known you, because once someone changes the way you see reality, there is no returning to the version of yourself that existed before. Awareness has no reverse. Truth has no undo button. Recognition has no opposite. It simply becomes part of you. And that's where I finally stopped asking whether this connection was real. Reality doesn't need permission to exist. It simply exists. The only question left now is whether I'll have the courage to live honestly inside the reality that has really changed me. Because some people don't just walk into your life. They quietly become part of the person you're still becoming, and once that happens, there is no going back. Only forward, into a future that began changing the moment our paths crossed. There's something no one tells you about rare connections. They don't become heavier because the other person changes. They become heavier because eventually you run out of places to hide from yourself. That's where I am now. Not questioning you, questioning every belief I built before you existed in my world. For years, I convinced myself that distance was strength, that needing no one meant I could never be disappointed, that staying unreadable meant staying safe. I wore those beliefs like armor, not because I enjoyed isolation, but because armor becomes comfortable after you've worn it long enough. You stop noticing its weight. You mistake protection for identity. I did, until your presence quietly exposed something I never expected. The armor wasn't protecting me anymore. It was preventing me from being fully alive. You never pointed that out. You never challenged it. You simply stood in front of me without wearing any armor of your own. And somehow, that became impossible to ignore. Do you know what honesty really is? It isn't saying everything you feel. It isn't revealing every secret you carry. Honesty is standing in front of another soul without needing to become someone else to deserve being understood. That kind of honesty is rare because most people perform. They become louder to hide their fear, kinder to hide their anger, stronger to hide their pain. They spend their lives introducing versions of themselves while the real person quietly watches from behind the curtain. I knew that game too well. I mastered it. I knew exactly how much of myself to reveal, exactly how much mystery to leave behind, exactly how to remain close enough to be appreciated, but distant enough to never be truly touched. It worked until because you never responded to the version I presented. You responded to the person standing silently behind it, the one I thought no one could see, the one I had almost forgotten myself. That's when something inside me shifted. Not dramatically, not all at once, like ice beginning to melt beneath the first warmth of spring. Quietly, petly, without asking permission, I realized I was becoming tired. Not tired of life, not tired of people. Tired of pretending that distance was the same thing as peace. They aren't. Distance removes noise, peace removes fear, and those are not the same. You showed me that without ever trying. Your presence asked nothing from me, no performance, no explanation, no proof, just authenticity. And strangely, authenticity felt more terrifying than any rejection ever could. Because rejection only hurts what you've shown. Authenticity risks everything you've hidden. That's why this matters. Not because you became important, but because around you, I stopped negotiating with the truth. I stopped editing my thoughts before they reached the surface. I stopped measuring every sentence before speaking it. For the first time in years, silence didn't feel like a shield. It felt like trust. Not trust that you would always stay. Trust that I no longer needed to disappear inside myself. That realization changed something. I can never rebuild the old way. Because once you've experienced what it feels like to exist without pretending, every mask becomes unbearably heavy. And maybe that's what transformation actually is. Not becoming someone new. Finally having the courage to stop hiding the person who was there all along. If that's true, then perhaps this connection was never here to complete me. Perhaps it came to remove everything that was never truly me in the first place. And if that's what you've unknowingly done, then the person I was before you is someone I can never become again. Every journey like this eventually reaches a place where silence is no longer enough. Not because the connection disappears, but because the truth grows too large to remain unspoken. I think I've arrived there. For the longest time, I believed I still had time. Time to observe, time to analyze, time to keep this safely contained inside my own mind. But I understand something now. The deepest truths don't wait forever. They don't force you. They simply become impossible to ignore. That's what this has become. Not a feeling, not a question, a reality. I've spent so much of my life believing that certainty comes after proof. That every important decision should be supported by logic, by evidence, by outcomes I can predict. But this connection never followed those rules. It existed before the evidence. It remained through every doubt. It survived every attempt I made to explain it away. And now, the only thing left to question is myself. Because the greatest obstacle was never this connection. It was the version of me that believed control was more valuable than truth. Control gave me certainty, but truth gave me freedom. And freedom has always been more frightening, because freedom asks you to live honestly, without guarantees, without perfect outcomes, without knowing exactly how the story ends. That has always terrified me, not failure, not rejection, the unknown. Yet here I am, standing in front of something I cannot fully explain, and for the first time in my life, I don't feel the need to run from it. I don't need every answer. I don't need every possibility mapped out before I take a single step, because I've realized something that changed everything. Some connections are not meant to be solved. They're meant to be lived. The moment I understood that, the fear began to lose its power, not all at once, but enough for me to stop treating this like a mystery that needed decoding, enough to start seeing it for what it truly is, a turning point, not because you rescued me. No one can do that. The deepest transformations are always chosen from within. You didn't save me. You revealed me. You became the mirror that reflected a version of myself I had spent years hiding behind achievement, discipline, logic, and distance. When I looked into that reflection, I didn't see perfection. I saw honesty, Dadar, unfiltered, undeniable. And strangely, that was enough, because honesty has a quiet power. It doesn't demand applause. It doesn't seek validation. It simply stands there, unchanged, until you're finally ready to stop looking away. That's what I've done. I've stopped looking away. I've stopped pretending that this can be reduced to coincidence. I've stopped believing that the strongest person is the one who never changes. Real strength isn't refusing transformation. Real strength is recognizing the moment life asks you to become someone greater and having the courage to answer. Maybe that's what this has always been. Not the story of two people finding each other, but the story of one soul finally finding the truth it had been avoiding all along. And perhaps you were never sent into my life to give me answers. Perhaps you were the question that awakened every answer already waiting inside me. So if this is where certainty finally begins, then I no longer fear what comes next. Because I understand something I never understood before, the rarest connections don't change your destination, they change the person who walks toward it. And once that person changes, the future changes with them. There is no returning to who I was, there is only becoming who I was always meant to be. And for the first time, that no longer feels frightening. It feels like home.